Most of the time, the soldiers at war are young men. And a simple mistake could put their life and the people around them in danger. And in this video, we're gonna talk about 5 different mistakes that happened during World War II. Since the first day being a pilot became a thing, they've always been a show-off. And that was a thing back in World War II. And even the pilots of the Japanese army thought they were better than everybody. In 1942, Jack E. Conger, with his F-4 fighter, flies over the Solomon Islands. Then he begins a battle with Japanese planes. And back then, the planes used to shoot at each other, and the other ones always try to escape the bullets. And they would never let an enemy plane try to get behind them. The Solomon Islands was in the control of the Japanese Empire, and that is why the amount of Japanese planes was a lot higher. Eventually, a Japanese pilot is able to get behind Jack Conger, but just as the Japanese was able to kill the American pilot, he decides to have a little fun, and he starts to play around with his plane around Conger's plane. While he was playing around, all of a sudden, Conger is right behind him, and Conger was easily able to burst his gun and kill the Japanese pilot. You could say Conger was supposed to die that day, but he stays alive and tells us this story. Nobody can say what this Japanese pilot was thinking. You don't mess around with the enemy. And that is why this is known as one of the dumbest mistakes in World War II. Let's get to the next mistake. You know, you're not supposed to mess around with explosives, and that goes from a firecracker all the way to an atomic bomb. There's no joking around, because it will hurt you. In World War II, the Japanese had a weapon called the Type 89, and it was just a basic grenade launcher. It was a very useful tool for the Japanese army. It could launch 25 grenades a minute, and this simple small weapon allowed the Japanese to gain a lot of land in World War II. In 1943, when the Japanese army was retreating on land, when the Americans took over, they were confronted with a lot of these Type 89 grenade launchers, but they didn't know how it worked. Then a very smart person comes along and says this is a knee mortar, so you have to lean it against your knee and drop the grenade in. They all believe that, and the guy said, I'll try it myself. He put the Type 89 on his thigh and he dropped the grenade in. The kick is so strong, it ends up breaking the guy's femur. But between the US Army, it wasn't just this guy that fell for it. A lot of others fell for the trap as well. And then eventually they realized that you're supposed to put it on the ground and drop the grenade in. If there was Instagram back then or text messages, everybody would know the first day how this thing works. A lot of people got hurt until they realized how it actually works. Guns like this always caused trouble at war. Another one is a mortar, and it's pretty similar to a grenade launcher but bigger. The British designed their mortars in a way that before the tip hits the ground, it's not gonna explode. It had a very sensitive tip, and whenever it hit somewhere, it would explode. The British Army knew how to work this thing, and it was very useful for their army. Yugoslavia started having a war with the Germans, and to help them, the British Army sends these mortars their way. In the middle of the war, the British Army drops care packages for Yugoslavia filled with these mortars. The way the packages arrived, the Yugoslavian army had to assemble them, and in the box, it had instructions on how to assemble it. But it seems like some people didn't speak English over there, and they make a mistake of putting the primer on the backhand instead of the tip. And when they drop the mortar inside, it explodes right then and there. If there were cameras back then, you would have the most insane footage using these mortars. And that's how some of the Yugoslavia soldiers killed themselves on accident. Until they realized how it actually works, a lot of them were killed. For the next story, we have to go to Holland in September 1944. The British have a plan to get the Netherlands back from the Germans. Their plan was to drop thousands of paratroopers in Holland, and whenever they land, they begin the war and fight the Germans. It was a very good plan, and they succeed. But between these paratroopers, there was a guy by the name of Private Cassidy. The Bren he was using decides to jam when he lands. And he was so anxious that he didn't know what to do. How is he gonna unjam his weapon? He thinks to himself that he should smash it on the ground so it releases. The gun eventually releases, but the bullet goes through Cassidy's chin and to his brain, and a stupid death is recorded. Nobody smart would hit their gun on the ground like that. But you can't blame him. He was a young man at war, and the anxiety he was feeling is like no other. He had no time to logically think at that moment. Another part of World War II is that the Polish army worked with the British army, and even the British themselves say some of the best pilots they had was Polish pilots. One of those insane Polish pilots was Zestaw Karkowski. Back then, the German Air Force would fly over to England and start to dogfight with the British army. In one of these dogfights, a bullet hits Karkowski's engine, and he was forced to jump out of the airplane with his parachute. He wasn't worried because he knew he's landing in England. He eventually lands, but he lands somewhere sketchy, a rural area in England where everybody hates the Germans. The people say this guy is a German pilot, and with his thick Polish accent he says, "I'm a Polish pilot and I fly for the British Army." And the British people tell themselves, this guy is lying, he's clearly a German. You can even tell by his accent. And the rural people decide to beat him to death. War is a very bad thing. It is true that we wanted to have some fun with this video, but it's not really funny. But please let us know which one of these stories was the most stupid.